Adrian Weller, Program Director for AI at the Turing Institute, and I work in machine learning at the University of Cambridge. I've always been interested, as long as I can remember, I've been interested in intelligence, so understanding human intelligence and artificial intelligence. My dad is a psychiatrist, and I would grow up with my brother going to meet my dad for lunch in mental hospitals, and he would say he doesn't feel at home unless he's in a mental hospital. I think he was joking. He would sometimes have patients come to our home, and so my brother and I would sometimes be entertaining mental patients before they were going to see our dad. So we early on had an interesting perspective on the ways that the human mind can perform in different kinds of directions. But I've always been very interested in what it means, what human intelligence really means. I think that's one of the very deepest questions. And then I think another question that can possibly rival that in terms of depth is, what does intelligence mean more broadly? So long been interested. But my path into where I am today is maybe a little bit different from some other folks you've been speaking to, in that I spent quite a few years working in finance, in trading in the markets. But there was a natural pause in what I was doing there, and I had some time off where I had a sort of non-compete period. And I thought that if I didn't try to get back into this sort of thing, if I didn't do it then, it really would be too late. So I went back into an academic world and did a PhD a bit later on, and was then really excited to be able to come back to the UK and to engage at Cambridge and to engage here. Sure. I think all of us are very heavily influenced by those around us and by all the aspects of culture which touch upon us. So I'm sure, yes. But are you asking, were there any very specific things that I can remember?
I'm curious if there was something specific.
I doubt anything unusual. All the usual sorts of things. So Asimov's books, 2001, all the usual sorts of things, I guess. Let me just think if there was anything unusual. So one of the earliest stories, this is not about fiction, but one of the earliest stories that I hear from my parents about my behavior was that when I was maybe 4 or so, I was looking at a fly and observed to my dad that they're really just machines, aren't they? So for a while I've been thinking, I don't know about that. I don't know what Turing said about flies, but I think that I think human beings are amazing, creatures are amazing, but it's also amazing sometimes to try and think about the ways that they work. So I'm broadly interested in quite a range of things. Initially I was very interested in graphical models and inference in graphical models and ways to try to perform inference and learning at scale efficiently. Some of those questions relate to sort of the limits of what can be solved in polynomial time. Oops. You see, we come across all kinds of technical challenges, and it's hard to anticipate them all. So inference in graphical models, but then I've become very interested. I'm broadly interested across a wide range of things. So at the Turing, I'm involved in all kinds of different areas, but the main areas of my research focus on various aspects of what I would describe as technical approaches to safe and ethical AI. We're seeing significant increases in capabilities of AI systems, and that's leading to deployment broadly across society in ways that already have impact on many of our lives through areas such as hiring decisions, or even more directly in criminal justice, but also even more broadly in areas which perhaps seem a bit less severe, but I think still are very important, for example, in social media. So those are things which we're recommended to look at, the way that we see the world in a way filtered through a digital lens, controlled by companies who are motivated to get us to click on things in the short run, so that may not be in our long-term best interest. So I think the sorts of challenges around that are pressing, very interesting, and very important. They reveal things about us and what we want for our lives, and they raise lots of really deep challenges that are highly interdisciplinary, so they relate to ethics and social science, but also there are a lot of really deep, interesting technical questions that tie into that. So one of my other affiliations, actually, that I didn't mention at the beginning, is I lead a project at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, which is based in Cambridge, but also has other branches, other spokes around the world, including with Murray Shanahan, who I think you're going to be seeing later. So that group focuses broadly on societal implications of AI, and I care a lot about those. So my project there is on trust and transparency, which ties in with this. We also have a project here which I coordinate on fairness, transparency, and privacy. But more broadly, I would suggest that as these algorithmic systems are deployed across society, one way to have an overarching perspective on at least how I think about them is that we'd like to feel that we're able to trust these technologies. And it's dangerous to trust things too much. When you trust something, you're exposing a vulnerability, and you want to make sure that you're not going to be abused. So following what some other folks have said, I don't know if you've seen the work of Baroness Honora O'Neill and others. So she says, no, we need to have measures of trustworthiness, and she's talking about dealing with people. She talks about reliability, honesty, and competence. I suggest that when we're talking about AI systems, I'm going to give you a laundry list of things which I think are important to focus on. Each of these has really important areas of technical research, and all of them it's important to connect with social scientists and philosophers, etc. But I'm very interested in the technical aspects of all of these. So I would make my list as fairness. So that certainly includes measuring and mitigating bias against any individual or any particular subgroups. Transparency, which is very broad, but certainly includes things like understanding where data comes from that's used to train algorithms, how it's been processed, how it was decided where to get that data, and then all the issues around interpretability. So how can we try to understand how algorithms are really working? And we could speak about that for a long time. I think that there are actually a lot of different kinds of transparency depending on to whom you're trying to explain and what the context is. Happy to speak a lot about that. Privacy and security, so how can we ensure appropriate protection of individuals' privacy? There are many applications where we believe we could learn all kinds of amazing things if only we could gather together lots of people's data. But of course, people are rightfully worried about concerns over their privacy. So healthcare would be a very important example. Related to privacy, there's security. So how can we also ensure that systems are robust against cyber attack, not only traditional forms of cyber attack, if that's the right way to describe them, but also more recent forms of attack, specifically on machine learning or AI systems, so so-called data poisoning attacks. So fairness, transparency, privacy, security. Along with security, I'd talk about resilience. So even if part of a system goes down, how can we try to ensure that a system remains resilient and being able to operate, a bit like an ant colony, can work well if part of it goes down. Robustness, by which I mean something a little bit different. So we're used to a machine learning paradigm where we learn a model in the lab and we expect that the data we'll see later on will be of the same kind, will be IID. But often, of course, that's often not the case in the real world. So how can we try to ensure that an algorithm will reliably perform well even when it comes across settings that are very different from those on which it was trained? So that's a very broad field. It includes things like modeling uncertainty. So if we know that an algorithm is uncertain about what to do, it might want to switch to a safe fallback mechanism and raise some kind of alarm. That uncertainty obviously may also help guide it towards knowing where it should next look in order to learn best. And it includes a whole host of interesting areas, including, for example, robustness against adversarial perturbations, in some sense the worst possible kind of thing. And some other areas I'd mention are control. So how can we ensure that as systems become increasingly autonomous, they do the things we would like them to do? And influence, by which I mean broadly this area which we've already touched on, which is we know that algorithms are influencing us and nudging us in various ways. How can we try to quantify that and control it so that we can attempt to ensure in a transparent way that we know that that we're being nudged in a direction which we want to be nudged? Good. That's a fantastic question. But if I may, can I go back on your previous comment? In terms of public concerns over these technologies being deployed, I had two more thoughts. One is that, of course, another super important area is the impact on the workforce, so disruption to jobs. But I'd suggest that there's less that I can immediately do from a technical perspective to try to improve AI systems from in that way. There clearly are quantitative analyses that you can do that people like Mike Osborne have been involved with, which are really interesting and important. But in terms of public concerns, the other thing I'd say, when you talk about systems have already been deployed, I think an important point to make is that, as you well know, if you're an academic and you want to try to release some system to learn information about what the public do, you have all kinds of important ethical hurdles you need to overcome before you're allowed to do that. You have ERB boards or other kinds of ethics boards you need to get through. And that establishes a very different set of criteria for what's necessary compared to the mentality of a startup, which may have the mindset of move fast and break things.
Direct quote, I believe, from somebody in a startup land.
That's right, and you can understand why they feel that way. So we're in a world where, well, it's always been the case that if you can establish market dominance and establish a moat around your business, that's just a great thing to do from a commercial perspective. Arguably, it's even more important, and there are even more opportunities to do that today in the digital realm. So therefore, you really want to be the first guy, and you want to establish that moat. So you really do need to move fast and break things in order to get there quickly, to hone your product and get there.
So it takes all mentality.
Not only mentality, but it's a fact. It's arguably an empirical observation in many companies that we see today in social media or driving, transport applications, various things like that. And so given that, there's a great incentive for people to move fast and break things. And I think we need to pause and think about what that means for society. So are we okay with people adopting that kind of behavior, or do we need to think about some possible kind of regulation around that? And when we do that, I don't at all suggest that there's an obvious answer. And clearly there are advantages to developing these things. They can be really good for mankind. So we need to weigh up the pros and cons. And I should mention that the one thing that I think the UK is doing well is that I think they've been thoughtful about these kinds of issues. And they've just set up something called the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. I don't know if you know about that. But that's a sort of stewardship body to think medium to long term about these kinds of issues. I think it's really, really important that if I say we in the technical community we have a great responsibility to communicate effectively with the public and with a really broad audience, so that we can try to have an informed discussion and debate about some of these topics. The issues which I mentioned are that there are properties that I think many people would agree we'd like systems to have, but that's a bit like saying, for our economy, we would like to have low taxes and we'd like to have a huge social safety net. There are often trade-offs between these different things. And in order to have a proper discussion and debate about the trade-offs, we need an informed public. So I think we have an obligation to tell the public about what's going on, how it works, how it's affecting them, so that we can try to have this kind of discussion. Now, it's not easy. If I were to ask you when's the last time you think we've had an informed discussion debate about anything, it's challenging, but it's really important that we try. And we can talk about how to try to do that in a second. Clearly, it's also important as we think about these issues to be interacting with and working with policymakers, social scientists, economists, ethicists, etc. So we really need to work closely with them, but we do need to inform the general public and to help them understand what's happening and to work with them. And then to try to talk about how can we best do that, I don't claim to be a great expert, but there are some things we can try to do. There's been nice work in this country where DeepMind partnered up with the RSA, and Turing's getting involved in some of that work to have kind of citizen juries to ask them how they feel about different issues. We've partnered with the BBC recently to try and help inform the public. I think that's a really good channel. And actually, I think the BBC is interesting. Of course, you could have any media partner to help communicate, and that might work well. The BBC is particularly interesting because they have an explicit mandate not to try to make money, but to inform the public and to be a responsible operator that tries to present balanced perspectives. And that's also a separate issue, which we're talking to them about, and is interesting, is what should a responsible media company do in this age? Do you mean how has it affected the jobs that people do?
Yeah, how has it affected what people do from beginning to end of day? So the jobs they do, or the way they work, or how they derive efficacy from their work?
It's a great question, and I'm sure that there are great experts on this, and I think it's important to get reliable data on this, because if we're trying to think forwards about the changes which we're likely to see, it's really important to be able to look historically and see what has happened. So I don't claim to have expertise. I'll tell you some things which occur to me off the top of my head. Clearly, it's had a massive impact. And I think you asked specifically about what impact AI has had.
Yeah, on the way we work.
But can I...
But you can broaden to computational technology.
Or can I broaden just to technology?
Yeah.
Because a lot of these issues, I think, are really more about technology than specifically about AI, although AI does have some particular issues associated with it. But clearly the whole world has been transformed even, I mean, I don't know how far back we can go, but fire, or sort of, the ways that humans live together has been transformed by our ability to produce food more effectively and to be able to live together in closer harmony. Things like email or the various ways we can communicate very efficiently means that it's perhaps less necessary to actually work together in person, although I still think it's by far the best way to work and to be face to face. There's some good examples from Alan Turing's life as we sit here. I'm sure you know that many of the computations used to be carried out by what were called computers, which were people who were often individuals, often women, who would be actually doing the computations. And so even what we call a computer has changed dramatically just because automated computational capacity has changed. So clearly that's had an enormous impact. But broadly, anything to do with those kinds of calculations or computations has become enormously easier. We've recognized for decades that computers are much better than us at doing those sorts of things. So adding numbers together or doing those kinds of calculations or having spreadsheets. And it's interesting to see how, this isn't quite your question, but the way that we think about what real intelligence is and as humans, we often like to think about ourselves as having something that's very special. As we see technology enable computers to do things that we thought we were the best at doing, we shift those into a category where we think that those are perhaps not such important in terms of intelligence. But for a long time we've had computers do things that are better than us in particular ways, and those ways keep expanding. And clearly, as machines get better than us at doing those things, we shift to doing other things. And for the most part, I suggest that is a good thing. It enables us to focus on areas which for the most part so far have been more interesting for us, and it enables us to be much more productive in total. But of course it does raise questions about how that will impact things over time, and will there be big disruptive effects which we need to think about. Yeah, so I think there are many aspects to that. I'll talk about two of them. So one of them is just the direct potential impact through inequality. So the economy is a complex system, and you get complicated, unexpected consequences of things. But I would suggest that for the most part, most of the time, technology is a kind of multiplier that enables people with greater ability to use it to expand the degree to which they can contribute more than people who are not so well capable of using it. And therefore, that leads to greater inequality if you don't do anything about it.
This is between the technologically fluent and those who don't have that fluency.
That's right. For the most part, of course, there are all kinds of issues around that, but for the most part, I would suggest that technology does tend to do that. I mean, it doesn't always. So, as an example, it will, as we were saying before, it enables more efficient communication. So, it can enable people, say, in a developing country to perform a job which they wouldn't have been able to do before, because you can link up to them directly, and that is improving their capabilities, enable them to earn more money than they would before, so raising their standard of living. And overall, we should keep in mind, as people like Steven Pinker point out, that the number of people who live in poverty has been reducing in absolute terms at quite a rapid clip. So that's all great. There's a lot of great stuff going on. On the other hand, there are also increases in inequality, and I think that it's right to think of that as one issue about dignity. I think that as human beings, we're social animals, and when we live near, or we see some sort of peer group, even if it's through social media or on the television, we're constantly reminded that people who live much better lives than us, that is arguably an issue about dignity. So that's one aspect. Another aspect I'll touch on that I think people often think about is things like being cared for, particularly for the elderly. So the world population is generally aging significantly. There's a significant demographic shift, and there are strong differences of opinion about whether people think it's a good or a bad thing that the elderly may be increasingly looked after by machines. Some people think that's an assault on their dignity and is a terrible thing. And it's easy to see where people come from thinking that, but at the same time, there are plenty of people who are getting older who have no help whatsoever, and surely they should have the right at least to be taken care of by these kinds of robots or machines. And what if they actually prefer it to be looked after by people? Well, how do we feel about that? So I think there are a lot of issues that are interesting to explore, and to some extent we'll see how they play out. I think that's a complex question. So you used the phrase something like power is transferred from a human to an AI system. Is that what you said?
That's right.
And I think that there's there are important things to discuss about whether that ever happens. So is the AI system ever actually really in control, or is it ultimately the user of that system who has the power? And there are aspects of the answer to that which go in both ways. Certainly in terms of accountability and responsibility, I think it's really important, at least for the foreseeable future, that we hold accountable the operator of an AI system as we would hold accountable the operator of any technological system if something goes wrong. So we shouldn't allow anyone to say, no, it wasn't me, it was my algorithm, and therefore to avoid culpability. So it's unclear whether the algorithm actually has any direct power. On the other hand, though, let me give some examples where it certainly feels as if it does. And then lastly, perhaps I'll describe situations where it might seem as if it doesn't, but in practice, maybe it does.
And you mentioned the criminal case earlier, the crime.
Yeah.
So that might be one to throw in there too, because that's maybe another example.
Yeah, good. Remind me about that if I don't come back to it. But there are already settings where I suggest that algorithms are operating in the wild at speeds that mean it's impossible for a human really to intervene meaningfully. And so I think it would be hard to argue that they are not operating by themselves in some aspect. And a great example would be trading algorithms, so high-frequency trading algorithms, where they are competing certainly at the millisecond basis, maybe even microsecond basis, against each other in a very high-stakes game. And they have real-world impact in ways which are sometimes difficult to foresee, which is an interesting thing for us to consider and think about. So typically these systems in normal circumstances add liquidity to the markets, help the markets function more efficiently, but there are concerns that when things go wrong, potentially things can go wrong in worse ways. We've already seen things like flash crashes. And it shows that even if we can understand exactly how one system operates, when it's out in the world and operating against a whole set of other agents, it can be really quite difficult to predict the sorts of consequences that can happen if various things go wrong.
Like emergent phenomena.
Emergent phenomena, that's right. Do you want me to do that right now, or do you want me to come back to the second part of the previous question?
You're right. Let's go back to the second part.
Okay.
Please.
So situations where it may not seem as if they have power, but I suggest that they would have power. And maybe we'll use an example from criminal justice, which I think is an extremely important set of use cases, which are where we're starting to see increasing use, particularly in the States. There's been a lot of attention, I'm sure lots of people have talked about this, around a particular algorithm called Compass, which attempts to predict recidivism risk. And it's used to help decide whether or not to grant people parole, or even to help decide how long they should be locked up for. And that's obviously it's a very important issue. If an algorithm tells me that I should be locked up for 6 years, the first thing I would say is there are important requirements about transparency. So I'd really want to understand how did it come to that conclusion, check that it followed due process, correct process, in a way that would allow me meaningfully to challenge it. So I think that's actually one really good clear use case where you do really need to have transparency. There are other cases where perhaps you don't need to, but you really do need certain kinds of transparency, the kind of transparency that enables meaningful challenge. The concerns that were raised, though, interesting, were not so much about transparency, and were also interesting not so much about accountability, which is a big deal. Just to comment on that, I'd say that the judges that are using the system, I think, absolutely need to be held accountable if it doesn't work correctly. And that's an important subtopic. But the way in which they were attacked was about fairness. Was it treating different groups fairly? And that's another whole big topic. Roughly speaking, there's a lot to think and say about what does it mean for an algorithm to be fair. And there are various ways you might try to define fairness. And in the technical community, what we typically like to do is we like to be told exactly what fairness means as a formula. So then we can say, okay, thank you, that's what it means. Now I can optimize my algorithm subject to this constraint. And if I can do that efficiently, I can write a paper too, and that will be really great. And then, as I'm sure you know, there's a whole field where we've got about 20 different definitions of fairness, and there are lots of different papers talking about how you can optimize with respect to these different definitions. And as you might expect, it turns out that you can't simultaneously enforce many of these constraints at the same time, because it turns out to be impossible to do that. The ethicists and the lawyers, on the other hand, say, you guys are crazy, you don't understand, you haven't got the correct notions about judgment and an appreciation of context that are really important to really understand what fairness means. And both sides have a point. I would suggest, though, that it's actually really healthy that we're getting this interaction because it's helping us to sharpen what we think we really want to have as a fairness measure. But coming back to actually what you asked about, sorry, I've drifted a bit. I think that if an algorithm makes a recommendation for how long someone should go to jail, and that goes in front of a judge, the judge might or might not take it on board. Well, first thing to say is that rather than myopically focusing on whether what the algorithm outputs is a fair output, we should be looking at the combined system, the human and the machine together, and is the machine helping the human produce a sort of combined output which is more fair, more reasonable or not? Because you could imagine you could have a very biased judge who chooses to go along with the algorithm when it says the same thing as him, but chooses to overrule it when it goes the other way, and arguably you could have a fair algorithm, but it's being used to increase and exacerbate unfairness. So that's one important point. But again, now coming back to your question, and it's perhaps not so realistic in this specific setting, but let's imagine you had a setting where the algorithm was making its recommendation and the judge would agree with it, say 98% of the time. Well, over time, people get a bit tired of looking. People are naturally a bit lazy, and actually it's a good thing in many cases because it gets them to try to be smart about doing things. But if as a human you're meant to be making a decision, but actually the machine is getting it right 98% of the time, you're unlikely to start really paying as much attention over time. This is an example of what's sometimes called technological enfeeblement. If some technology does something for you, we as humans become less good at doing that. Over time, that hasn't been such a bad thing. We've got worse at remembering large volumes of information because we developed writing, but that's been okay. But it's unclear how that will necessarily work out going forwards, and specifically in this kind of case, the human can eventually just really become a rubber stamping entity, a rubber stamping machine that's just saying, yes, I agree, and it's unclear whether the human does really have any control, even though it might look like a human is in the loop, to use the expression. And this is really important so that there's legislation like the GDPR that I'm sure you're familiar with that has been introduced in Europe recently, which has different rules depending on whether or not a human is in the loop. But sometimes whether formally a human is in the loop doesn't necessarily imply that they are really engaged in the process. I think we've already covered quite a lot of these issues. So the issues we talked about before about when is a machine actually taking the decision for itself, I think is extremely close really in spirit to what we mean by autonomy, taking actions or predictions by itself.
So I'll push on that a little bit. If we consider machines that can make predictions by themselves or make decisions...
I misspoke, yeah. Predictions is okay. Actions or decisions by themselves.
Actions or decisions by themselves. Something that you have said, though, is the idea that we need to hold accountable somebody who's using that system.
Yeah.
If we look forward a little bit and think about, for instance, a self-driving system, self-driving car system, that is adapting in some way and learning some way, and therefore its behavior is a mixture of what the person in the car does with it and its sort of genetic precedent of how it started. How do we think about ascribing responsibility to the decisions it makes and the harm that it might do?
It's a great question. Just before I get to that, can I suggest that one interesting thing to look at, which is not immediately obvious as an analogy for artificial intelligence, this is something that David Runciman at Cambridge talks about, is that when we think about these topics, don't just think about artificial intelligence, think about artificial agency. So it turns out that we have a long tradition for hundreds of years of setting up artificial agents, that is, agents who aren't real persons, and we even call these things persons, and those are companies, sometimes countries, but certainly limited liability corporations. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting to reflect on why those were set up and what were the benefits and disadvantages of doing it. Clearly one disadvantage is exactly along the lines that I said and maybe you're raising, is that if I'm worried that my algorithm is going to do something that's wrong, I was just arguing that, well, it shouldn't be okay for me to release it in the world, but say if it goes wrong, it's its fault. I should remain liable. And yet having a limited liability company around something does exactly enable that. I can say, well, I set up this company, the company has released a product, if the product goes wrong, the company goes bust, but I'm protected. There's this limited liability. So I think it's really interesting to look at that again and think about these issues. In fact,
the EU has a preamble now on the concept of considering personhood for certain kinds of robots.
They do, and I think I don't think that'll be taken very seriously in the near future. I mean, it was taken somewhat seriously. I think it was perhaps even debated in European Parliament, but I think it's unlikely to happen soon for the reasons that I gave. But I do think it's important also to compare to these issues about limited liability companies. But You also, I think you were touching on various other really important, interesting issues, which are really at the intersection of artificial intelligence and the law in some ways. So how do you know which person, including companies here, is liable if something goes wrong? And I'm not a lawyer. I'm very interested in working with lawyers, actually, and this is one of the questions that I think is a really important one. How should you ascribe liability in these kinds of cases? First, we should say that it's not a new thing that you have a complex technology and it can be difficult to figure out who's at fault. That's been going on for a long time. I think there was one great example that I heard about where maybe Toyota's had some problem with the brakes in the States maybe 20 or 30 years ago, and NASA got involved, an expert witness, to help opine on who should be held liable, and it was a whole complicated thing. We need to have practical ways. We can't always bring NASA in to opine on these kinds of situations. So we need to figure out how to have some scheme that enables us to assign liability in some reasonably efficient fashion. And we want whatever mechanism we come up with to be good in the sense that it encourages the right kinds of behavior in society. So that's a bit of a puzzle, but again, this isn't the first time this has been raised, but I think that there are issues specifically with machine learning systems that make this complicated. So at least in UK law, and you can tell me right away, there's probably a similar issue in US law about foreseeability of harm. So in general, if I do something and it was reasonable for me to foresee that it would cause harm, then I can be held liable. On the other hand, if I do something and it causes something totally unexpected that no one reasonably would have foreseen, then it's less reasonable to assign that liability to me. Now, with machine learning systems, by their essence, they're learning from data typically in order to find patterns which are very difficult for humans to see. So very likely they're going to be doing something which is hard to foresee. So how are we going to deal with that? I think it raises interesting questions. It also raises interesting questions about the way that these systems interact in complex ways, as we talked about before.
Yeah, this harkens back to the word transparency that you gave earlier as one of the major considerations.
Yeah, but let me speak to that. So I've argued for transparency, but let me raise some potential arguments on the other side against why sometimes transparency is not the best thing. First, there are often tensions. So I mentioned there are often tensions between all these different properties. One immediate tension that's easy to see is between transparency and privacy. So if I wanted to make everything transparent about my algorithm, particularly if it's a machine learning algorithm, its predictions, its behavior is typically going to be very dependent on the data on which it was trained. So if I really want to be totally transparent, I'll show you all the data on which it was trained. But that data might have personal information in it. There are clearly privacy constraints against being completely transparent. There are also concerns about the IP. Maybe I've got private IP and I don't want to share this information with you. There are lots of interesting ideas coming from areas like homomorphic encryption and secure multi-party computation that might allow, nevertheless, for aspects of the system to be checked without revealing the exact information. We have a paper about that. There was at ICML this year. So there are interesting questions around here, but that's just an example of one tension. Let me give an example of another tension, though, that's perhaps a little bit less obvious. I think transparency is often a means to an end and not actually the end that we really want. So as an example, people will say, of course, if autonomous vehicles are going to be riding around on the street, we need to understand exactly how they're operating. Otherwise, how can we possibly allow them to be on the streets? But ultimately, perhaps what we care about is having cars which drive around safely and don't kill people. Right now, humans kill a lot of people. Would you rather have autonomous vehicles which operate in a fully transparent way but kill 1 million people a year, or cars which we don't really understand but they only kill 100 people a year? And I think most people would go for the ones which empirically don't kill very many people. And that's actually somewhat similar to the way that we deal with aviation. We have a whole battery of tests that they need to satisfy. And if they satisfy those tests, you could imagine gradually letting cars out in the real world, seeing how they work. As long as they're not killing people, they're working well, maybe that's okay. So sometimes we care more about some of those other things I mentioned before, reliability, robustness, etc., than specifically about transparency.
Let me push back on that and ask you, because you suggested a dichotomy between cars that are opaque and kill fewer people or transparent and kill more people.
Yes.
But if we're designers and we get to decide how to design AI and learning systems in the future,
good.
Can't we decide that we want to make systems that are transparent and kill few people? Or is there some fundamental flaw in that direction because the transparency itself barriers us from killing few people?
Some people talk about transparency as a barrier and it necessarily being a trade-off between transparency and performance. We don't know exactly where the frontier is of that. It may be that we can have transparency and performance. It'll depend on many factors. But what there certainly is there's a question of opportunity cost. So we only have limited resources, we're only a certain number of people, and we have certain resources to deploy. Should we spend all those resources on transparency, or should we split them and maybe only have some of them on transparency and some on those other areas? And perhaps working directly on safety, for example, might be more important.
So let me ask one final question on that topic, which is, if you think about it, a metaphor of this, or analogy of this, is the Google search engine system. People demand transparency, so they want to understand why the search engine at Google rates them poorly. Yet, with transparency into Google's search engine comes gaming, and the fact that people can then manipulate the results because they understand the deterministic system that defines their results.
That's right. Isn't
that a tension we face with things like self-driving cars as well?
It's one of the drawbacks, one of the potential drawbacks of transparency. I'll speak to that, and I'll tell you some more if you like. So I have a paper on challenges for transparency that addresses why transparency can be bad in various contexts. But that's a general phenomenon, and it relates to... so whenever you release the rules of a system, people can try to game it. Sometimes that's actually good, but usually it's bad. It's usually good if you have complete knowledge about the way the world works and you've set the parameters exactly to what you really mean. So I've set up the rules and I'm so sure that these are the right rules that I'm happy for everyone to know them, because if they game them, that's only going to be good. Arguably that's the way the tax system works, arguably, or something like that, but perhaps not. But otherwise you're subject to what's sometimes called Goodhart's law. So Goodhart was one of the members of the Monetary Policy Committee, which is like the Fed here in the UK, and he observed that when you're dealing with the economy, you typically have certain macro measures of the economy, which would be good general indicators of economic performance. But if you then say, as a policy matter, you're going to focus on those, often you don't end up getting the benefits you hope, because you're pulling levers to try to optimize those specific things, which typically would be correlated with good things in the economy. But those relationships can break down when you focus exclusively on those. So
Moore's law for processing speed, becoming a edict rather than a description of what actually happens.
I'm not sure if it's quite the same thing. So tell me what you mean exactly by Moore's law.
Well, in the Intel Corporation case, that became the specific milestone. In other words, we have to create new benchmark algorithms that will perform at Moore's law on the new processor, rather than we're going to make processors as fast as we can, and oh look, they happen to follow Moore's law.
That's right.
Wagging the dog.
That's right. Or perhaps we should operate in a way that will maximize long-term shareholder value, or something like that. But it's tricky, because having some pretty robust, very specific measures can give people focus. And as long as they work reasonably well, that could be a good thing. But sometimes they don't work reasonably well. Can I point out one other issue with transparency, which is not obvious? So sometimes if you make information transparently available, it can actually lead to a system becoming less efficient. And there's a nice example from of something called Bryce's paradox. So, are you familiar with Bryce's paradox? So it's easy to see with a picture. So I'll just try to describe it briefly. And you could look at this paper if you're interested. And this specific example is due to Frank Kelly, who's a great professor at Cambridge. So if you imagine we've got a road system with cars coming in here, and they're going out here, and they have to decide where to go in the middle. The typical model of how cars will behave is that they will optimize the route they follow until they can't go any faster. So if everybody does that, the system will settle down to what's called a war-drop equilibrium, where no one can do any better by taking a different route. So everyone has the same delay going through the road system. Our reasonable assumption is that the more cars go down any particular road, the more delay everyone will suffer going down that road. And that's an example of what's called an externality in economics. So what I choose to do will have a cost which you'll have to bear as well as on me. And it's known in economics that when you have those kinds of situations, if everybody is selfishly optimizing their own best interests, you often won't get the best outcome for everybody. So anyways, we have this system, and everyone is doing the best, and we have a war-drop equilibrium. Now let's say that actually the whole time there was an extra road which existed somewhere in this network, but no one knew about it. And we're now going to make this information transparently available. So we're providing transparency to everybody. Typically an engineer thinks, oh gosh, we've added some capacity, this must be really good. But you can show in certain examples that actually, perhaps it makes more sense to think about this as you have enabled each of these individual agents, you've enabled them to more powerfully try to optimize their own self-interest, and that actually leads to everyone doing worse. So the new equilibrium actually has everyone going more slowly. So by transparently revealing more information, the system has behaved worse. And we should keep that in mind. This is maybe a different kind of transparency to what we were typically talking about before, but this does come up sometimes. So as an example, in Europe, there's something called MiFID II, which is a new form of regulation for financial securities. And I don't claim that I know the details. I'm not saying that this is going on here. But one thing it does is it makes certain requirements about transparency about what each agent is doing in the system, because that's thought to be a good thing to make the system work more efficiently. But I'm just noting that sometimes it can actually lead to worse outcomes. So would you like to define that, or would you like me to define it?
I would love for you to define it in your words.
Well, clearly, first, everybody means...
It's in the news, so.
Sure, it's in the news a lot less than artificial intelligence, and no one knows quite how to define that either. But broadly speaking, if we say that AI is something like trying to get machines to do things which behave in a way which would be considered intelligent, according to some definition, because what we think is intelligent keeps changing too. If AGI is something like getting machines which are able to think in a broad general way, a bit more like the way humans do, that is, we can learn from one domain, learn concepts and apply them in another domain. If we interpret it that way, which is, I would suggest, is a somewhat narrow definition compared to the way some people define it, then I think that we are getting close to that. So with techniques like transfer learning, we are starting to find ways to learn from one domain and apply them in a different domain. We don't yet manage to do that in a way where we, in any really meaningful way, I think, can extract concepts which make sense to us and can apply them in a different domain. I think that's a really exciting line of research, because if we could do that, it would help us in all sorts of ways. It would likely make performance more robust. It would likely make it more interpretable, all sorts of things. And it would add significant, tremendous capability to be able to do this kind of general learning. But sometimes what people mean is even much broader than that. They say, can we make machines which will be able to do pretty much everything that a human could do? And if we could do that, wouldn't it very quickly then do lots of things which are beyond what humans can do? And then we'd get some intelligence explosion, as I.J. Good called it, and where would we be, and would they take over, and what would this mean for mankind? So I don't dismiss those concerns. And some people poo-poo that, but I think that if we did do anything like that, it really, I think, would be one of the most significant things in the history of the planet, maybe even the most significant thing in the universe as far as we know it. So I think it does make sense to think about it, and it does make sense to suggest that we should maybe be concerned about that. So I don't think it's ridiculous to have those concerns. I do think that it's difficult to imagine what it would be and how it would behave. So I like the framework of focusing on near-term issues, near-term sort of safe and ethical issues as I described. Not only, well, actually, but now you ask, not only because I think they're really pressing important issues now, but also because they help give us a toolkit which will, we hope, be useful in the long term if we do start moving in that direction.
All right.
And actually, I guess I should also add, of course, if we could develop these generally intelligent machines, we shouldn't only think of it as a threat. I mean, it creates tremendous opportunities for mankind too, but we should have some eye to the potential dangers.